It all started on a rainy Monday morning. Marcus stepped into the gleaming glass building, holding his breath as he entered the lobby. He adjusted his tie and glanced at the company logo on the wall. He couldn't believe he was finally here. This was the job he had dreamed of for years, and now he had a chance to prove himself. Fresh out of business school, Marcus was eager, ready to work hard, and determined to make a difference. But even on his first day, something felt off. The receptionist barely made eye contact, and the few people he passed in the hallway seemed to glance at him a little too long, their polite smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Marcus shrugged it off, telling himself it was just first-day jitters. He had dealt with worse before. He wasn't going to let a few awkward stares throw him off. As he arrived at his department, Marcus was greeted by a tall man with graying hair and a sharp suit. His name was Mr. Denton, the manager of the team Marcus was joining. At first glance, Denton looked like the textbook definition of corporate success: confident, smooth-talking, and always in control. But there was something about his tone when he said, "You must be Marcus," that made Marcus feel like he was being sized up, like Denton was already making judgments about him. Marcus tried to brush it off. Denton handed him a stack of files, rattling off instructions about reports, deadlines, and team protocols. "We expect excellence here," Denton said, his voice cool and clipped. "Let's see if you can keep up." The first few weeks were tough, but Marcus was tougher. He worked long hours, determined to make a good impression. He triple-checked his reports, stayed late to meet deadlines, and volunteered for extra projects. But no matter how hard he worked, it seemed like Denton always found something to criticize. "This format isn't what I asked for," Denton would say, tossing a report back on Marcus's desk. Or, "Next time, try to think more strategically," even though Marcus had followed Denton's instructions to the letter. The feedback was never constructive. It felt like Denton was looking for excuses to undermine him. It wasn't long before Marcus started noticing other patterns. Denton's tone was always harsher with him than with his colleagues. Team meetings often felt like a performance where Denton would subtly single him out, questioning his decisions or dismissing his suggestions. It wasn't outright, but it was enough to make Marcus feel like he didn't belong. At first, Marcus wondered if he was imagining it. But then there were the offhand comments. "You're surprisingly articulate," Denton said one day after Marcus gave a presentation. Or, "You must have played basketball, right?" during a casual team lunch. The comments were masked as jokes, but they cut deep. Marcus confided in a colleague, Sarah, one afternoon when they were working late. "Does it feel like Denton has it out for me?" he asked cautiously. Sarah hesitated before answering. "Look," she said, lowering her voice. "Denton's old school. He's particular about who he thinks fits in here." She didn't say more, but her expression said enough. Marcus knew what she meant. He'd dealt with this kind of thing before, the subtle ways people tried to make you feel like you didn't belong, like you had to prove yourself twice as hard just to get half as far. But Marcus wasn't about to give up. He started keeping notes, documenting every interaction with Denton. He analyzed the feedback he got, looking for patterns, and despite the challenges, his work started to shine. Clients began requesting him for projects, and his colleagues started coming to him for advice. But the more Marcus succeeded, the more Denton seemed to double down. He'd assign impossible deadlines, only to blame Marcus if the team fell behind. He'd conveniently forget to invite Marcus to important meetings. And when Marcus landed a big client, Denton took all the credit in the next leadership update. The final straw came during a quarterly review. Marcus had prepared thoroughly, ready to showcase his accomplishments. But as he sat across from Denton in the small conference room, he could already tell how it was going to go. Denton leaned back in his chair, barely glancing at the folder of achievements Marcus had laid out. "You've had some wins," he said, his tone dismissive. "But there's still a lot you need to work on if you want to succeed here." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He wanted to push back, to list every project he'd nailed, every late night he'd spent getting things right. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Denton had made up his mind. As Marcus left the meeting, he felt the weight of all the weeks and months of effort pressing down on him. He wanted to scream, to quit, to walk out of the building and never look back. But then he thought about why he'd taken this job in the first place, to prove that he belonged, to prove that people like Denton couldn't hold him back. That night, Marcus made a decision. He wasn't going to let Denton define his worth. If the system was rigged against him, he was going to find a way to rewrite the rules. The next morning, Marcus walked into the office with a new sense of purpose. Denton might have been the boss for now, but Marcus was ready to play the long game. He was going to rise, no matter how hard Denton tried to keep him down. What Marcus didn't know was that this journey would lead him to uncover secrets about the company and about Denton himself that would change everything. The weeks that followed were a blur for Marcus. Each day, he showed up early and stayed late, pouring everything he had into his work. But despite his dedication, Denton's behavior never wavered. The snide comments, the condescending remarks, they were always there, simmering just below the surface. Marcus could feel it every time Denton walked into the room, his sharp eyes scanning him like he was a puzzle to be solved. At first, Marcus tried to stay focused on his goals. He wanted to build relationships with his colleagues, prove himself as a reliable team player. He took on more projects, volunteered to handle the more difficult clients, and even offered to mentor some of the younger employees. His colleagues began to take notice of his efforts, and for a brief moment, Marcus thought he might have finally found his place. But Denton's behavior only grew more bizarre. He would schedule meetings without informing Marcus, only to act surprised when Marcus showed up on time. He'd take credit for ideas Marcus had pitched months ago, presenting them as his own during team meetings. It became so frequent that Marcus couldn't ignore it anymore. Denton wasn't just being dismissive, he was actively sabotaging him. Sarah, who had initially been a sounding board for Marcus, began to pull away. At first, it was small things. Her responses were shorter, her smile more forced. But one day, after a particularly brutal exchange with Denton, Marcus found himself looking for Sarah, hoping for some kind of support. She was nowhere to be found. That afternoon, Marcus walked into the break room and overheard a conversation between two colleagues. "Did you hear about Sarah?" One of them whispered. "She's getting reassigned. Word is, Denton wants her out." The news hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Sarah was one of the few people who had been kind to him, and now even she was getting caught up in Denton's web. What had happened? Had she crossed him in some way? Or was it just a matter of time before Denton went after everyone who got too close to Marcus? Later that evening, Marcus stayed late, as he often did, to finish a presentation for an upcoming client. The office was mostly empty, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound breaking the silence. As he worked, he noticed a figure standing in the doorway. It was Denton, watching him from the hallway with an unsettling calm. Marcus felt a shiver run down his spine, but he kept his head down, pretending not to notice. "You're burning the midnight oil again, I see," Denton said, his voice almost too sweet. "I like that work ethic, but it's dangerous to push yourself too hard. You wouldn't want to make any mistakes, would you?" Marcus felt his blood boil, but he didn't show it. "I'm just making sure everything's perfect for the meeting," he replied evenly, trying to keep his composure. Denton stepped into the room, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he approached. "I'm sure it'll be fine," he said, eyeing the presentation slides on Marcus's screen. "But you do know, don't you, Marcus? Not everyone here is rooting for you. Some people would rather see you fail." Marcus clenched his fists under the desk. "I'm not afraid of failure." Denton smirked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm sure you aren't. But fear? That's a different story." He lingered for a moment, then turned on his heel and walked out, leaving a chilling silence in his wake. As the door clicked shut behind Denton, Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind racing. What was that supposed to mean? Was Denton warning him? Or was it just another one of his psychological games? Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on here, something darker beneath the surface. The following days were a blur of tension and confusion. Denton's subtle attacks continued, but now they seemed more deliberate, more personal. He would question Marcus in front of the team, undermining his decisions in front of clients, and always leaving just enough doubt in his words to make Marcus second-guess himself. It was a slow burn, a constant erosion of Marcus's confidence. One afternoon, Marcus found himself in a meeting with a major client, one he'd been working tirelessly to secure. It was the perfect opportunity to prove his value to the company. He'd spent days preparing, making sure every detail was in place. But as the meeting progressed, Denton's behavior reached a new level. He began to subtly cut Marcus off, steering the conversation in different directions, undermining his points with sharp, dismissive comments. Marcus could feel his face flush with frustration, but he kept his composure. He had to. He wasn't going to let Denton get away with it this time. Finally, after Denton interrupted him for the third time, Marcus snapped. "With all due respect, Mr. Denton," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I think the client is more interested in hearing my proposal." Denton's eyes flashed with surprise, but he quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Oh, I'm sure your proposal is great, Marcus, but I think we all know who the real expert here is." The tension in the room was palpable. The client shifted uncomfortably in their seat, clearly sensing the conflict. Marcus took a deep breath and tried to regain control of the conversation, but Denton's words hung in the air like a threat. That evening, Marcus found himself alone in the office once again, reflecting on the meeting. He had no doubt that Denton was trying to push him out, to make him look incompetent. But why? What was Denton really afraid of? As Marcus sat in his office, a thought began to form, one that sent a shiver down his spine. What if this wasn't just about him? What if Denton had been doing this to others before him, maybe even others in the company who had tried to rise above their place? The more Marcus thought about it, the more it felt like a pattern, like Denton wasn't just trying to hold him back. He was trying to maintain control, to keep the power in his hands. But how far was he willing to go to protect that power? And what would happen if Marcus decided to take it from him? He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a battle for a promotion anymore. This was about something deeper, something more dangerous. And if Marcus was going to survive it, he had to be prepared for what was coming next. The following weeks felt like a high-wire act for Marcus. Each day was a delicate balance of staying under the radar while pushing forward in his work. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Denton was always watching, ready to exploit any opportunity to undermine him. But the more Marcus tried to keep his head down, the more the stakes seemed to rise. It wasn't just the subtle sabotage anymore, it was personal. Denton seemed determined to strip away Marcus's confidence, to chip away at the foundations he'd worked so hard to build. And the worst part was, Marcus wasn't sure how to fight back without playing into Denton's hands. One evening, after another grueling day filled with ignored emails and brushed off ideas, Marcus found himself sitting in his car outside the office, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His mind was racing. Was it even worth it to continue in this toxic environment? He had a clear path ahead of him, but Denton's presence felt like a weight dragging him down. But as he sat there, another thought crept in. If he quit now, would he ever be able to live with himself? Was he really going to let Denton win? The idea of leaving, of just giving up and walking away, filled him with a sense of shame. Marcus wasn't the kind of person who ran from a fight, especially not one like this. No, he couldn't quit. But the question lingered. How could he fight back without making things worse? The tension in the office was starting to feel suffocating, and it wasn't just coming from Denton. Marcus could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him too. Some watched with quiet judgment, others with barely concealed curiosity. There was an undercurrent of suspicion around him. Was he going to break? Would he make it? Or was he already a failure in their eyes, just another casualty of Denton's reign? One day, after a particularly brutal meeting in which Denton had publicly criticized Marcus's work in front of the entire team, Marcus caught Sarah in the hallway. She was clearly avoiding him, but something in her eyes stopped him from letting her slip away again. "Sarah," he called softly, "we need to talk." She hesitated but finally nodded, leading him to a quiet corner of the office. Marcus could tell she was on edge, her shoulders tense, her hands folded tightly in front of her. "I'm sorry about what happened," Marcus said, his voice low. "Denton's been pushing me harder than ever, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on." Sarah looked around, checking to make sure no one was nearby. "It's not just you," she whispered. It's all of us. He's been isolating people for years. Slowly, piece by piece. And when he sees someone getting too close, too successful, he cuts them off." Marcus frowned, the weight of her words sinking in. "But why? What does he want?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "It's not just about power. It's about control. Denton has been here for decades, and he's worked his way to the top by keeping everyone else beneath him. He's a master at creating division, at making people fight for scraps. He's a manipulator, Marcus. He thrives on fear." Marcus felt the weight of the truth in her words. The pieces were finally starting to come together. Denton didn't just want to be the boss, he wanted to be the only one who mattered. And Marcus had become a threat to that. "But why are you leaving?" Marcus asked, a sharp edge to his voice. "You're one of the most capable people here, Sarah. You shouldn't have to put up with this." Sarah's eyes flickered with something, regret, maybe, or a quiet resignation. "It's not just Denton," she said. "It's the system. The whole company is built on a foundation of favoritism and manipulation. You can't fight it and win. People have tried." Marcus clenched his fists, frustration and anger bubbling up inside him. "So that's it. We just let him win. Let him destroy everyone who gets in his way." Sarah sighed, looking down. "No, Marcus. I'm not saying we let him win. I'm just saying, I can't do it anymore. I can't keep fighting for a system that doesn't want me to succeed, and neither should you." Her words hit him hard, more than he wanted to admit. But deep down, Marcus knew she was right. If he kept pushing against Denton's grip, it would only get harder. He had seen it happen to others before, but the thought of giving up, of walking away without taking a stand, felt worse than anything Denton could throw at him. As Sarah walked away, leaving him to wrestle with his thoughts, Marcus stood there in the hallway, feeling the weight of her decision on his shoulders. She was giving up. But Marcus couldn't. He had to figure out a way to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been crushed under Denton's rule. The next day, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. He had a decision to make. He could either bow to Denton's power, let him grind him down until there was nothing left, or he could start playing the game on his terms. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Denton wasn't just a bully, he was a master manipulator. But Marcus had one thing Denton didn't: the truth. As the day dragged on, Marcus began to formulate a plan. He wasn't just going to play Denton's game, he was going to turn the tables. The more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized that Denton's weakness wasn't just in his manipulation, it was in his arrogance. He underestimated people, always assuming he had the upper hand. Marcus wasn't going to let that be his downfall. But Marcus also knew that playing against Denton would require allies. He couldn't do it alone, not against someone as deeply entrenched as Denton. But who could he trust? Sarah had already made it clear that she was out, but Marcus knew there had to be others who were fed up with Denton's reign. The question was, how could he find them without drawing attention to himself? As the days passed, the tension between Marcus and Denton reached a boiling point. Every small confrontation, every subtle dig, only added fuel to the fire. But what was Denton's next move? Would he try to crush Marcus once and for all, or had he underestimated his resolve? The answers were unclear, but one thing was certain: Marcus was no longer going to be a passive player in this game. He was ready to fight back, and this time he wasn't going to stop until he took the power back from Denton's hands. Marcus spent the next few days walking a razor's edge. He knew the clock was ticking. Every moment he spent thinking about his next move was another moment Denton had to keep him under control. He had begun reaching out to a few colleagues, feeling the waters to see if anyone else was ready to stand with him. The stakes were high, and every word he spoke felt like it could tip the balance one way or the other. He was careful, asking only a few questions at first. "Have you noticed how Denton treats the team?" He would ask casually, letting the conversation drift toward the topic without seeming too pointed. But every time he was met with uncertainty, hesitation, or an awkward silence. It was clear. Most of them were too scared to speak out. They had seen what happened to those who did. But then one afternoon, things started to shift. Marcus was at his desk, going over a report, when he saw Jonathan, one of the senior analysts, approaching. Jonathan was a quiet guy, not one to make waves. But he had been friendly with Marcus from the start, offering him advice during those first chaotic weeks. Jonathan leaned against the cubicle wall, glancing around quickly before speaking. "Marcus, I heard what he was saying to Sarah the other day. About Denton." His voice was low, but there was an edge to it. "I think I'm with you." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "You are?" Jonathan nodded, his eyes flicking toward Denton's office down the hall. "I've been watching him for years. The guy's a snake. I've seen him do this to others before, cut them off, isolate them, make them think they're losing it. But he's not invincible." The words felt like a lifeline, and Marcus's pulse quickened. He knew Jonathan wasn't the type to speak out unless he was sure, and if he was in, then maybe others would follow. Slowly, word began to spread among the employees who had been silently enduring Denton's manipulation. Marcus wasn't alone anymore. But just as he thought the momentum was building, the tension in the office reached a new level. Denton started watching him more closely, his eyes sharp with suspicion. He'd stop by Marcus's desk unannounced, making small talk, asking questions that didn't seem to make sense, testing him, poking for any cracks in the facade Marcus had built. Every conversation felt like an interrogation, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Denton was onto him. One evening, as Marcus was leaving the office, he ran into Sarah by the elevators. She looked more tired than usual, her face drawn. "I thought you were done with all of this," Marcus said quietly, worried about the strain he saw in her expression. "I thought I was too," Sarah replied, her voice heavy. "But I'm not. Denton's starting to isolate people again. He's got eyes on me, and he's pushing harder, trying to make it look like I'm the problem." She paused, glancing around nervously. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep my head down." Marcus felt a surge of urgency. It was clear. Denton was playing a game he knew well, and Sarah was just one of the casualties. They were all in danger of being picked off one by one. But the more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized this couldn't go on. Something had to break. The next morning, as the team gathered for their weekly meeting, Marcus could feel the atmosphere change. Denton was more on edge than usual, his tone sharper, his questions more pointed. Every time Marcus spoke, Denton seemed to find a way to twist his words, make them sound less confident, less solid. It was the same routine, the same strategy Denton had used for years to assert his control. But this time, Marcus wasn't backing down. "Marcus," Denton called out, his eyes gleaming. "Can you explain why this proposal was submitted so late? I thought we discussed the timeline last week." Marcus stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "I followed the timeline. The delays were on your end. You didn't provide the necessary data until the day before the deadline." A small smile played on Denton's lips, but it wasn't friendly. "I see. So it's my fault then. You always seem to have a way of shifting the blame, don't you?" The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. Marcus could feel the eyes of the entire team on him, waiting to see how he would respond. But he wasn't going to let Denton manipulate the narrative anymore. "No, I'm simply stating the facts," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I've been working hard to make this project a success. It's not about blame, it's about accountability." Denton's smile faltered for a moment, and for the briefest of seconds, Marcus saw something in his eyes, a flicker of frustration. It was as if Denton wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of others. And in that moment, Marcus knew he had made an impact. But he also knew that Denton wouldn't back down quietly. The next few days were a tense waiting game. Denton began to shift his tactics, pushing harder, trying to put Marcus in situations where failure seemed inevitable. He would assign Marcus impossible tasks, then set him up for failure by deliberately withholding the resources he needed. It was a classic move for Denton: break Marcus down, make him doubt his abilities, and ultimately force him out. But Marcus wasn't backing down. With Jonathan's help, they started to quietly gather information, compiling evidence of Denton's sabotage and manipulations. They didn't have much time. Denton was growing more paranoid by the day, and it wouldn't be long before he realized what they were doing. Marcus knew that once the confrontation came, it would be a fight for everything he'd worked for. And then one fateful afternoon, Marcus received a message, a tip-off that Denton was planning something big. One of his allies had overheard Denton talking with higher-ups, scheming to orchestrate a smear campaign against Marcus, to have him fired under the guise of incompetence. The timing couldn't have been worse. Marcus was about to go head-to-head with Denton in a crucial meeting that would decide the fate of a major client. He could feel the weight of the entire office pressing down on him. This was it, the moment where everything would either fall apart or finally come together. But Marcus was ready. He couldn't afford to lose this fight, not when so much was at stake. The day of the meeting arrived, and Marcus could feel the tension building like a storm on the horizon. His team was counting on him to deliver, to prove that he was more than just the target of Denton's manipulations. He had spent the night going over the presentation, making sure everything was perfect. He couldn't afford to miss a single detail. This was his moment. As he walked into the conference room, the usual air of confidence that Denton exuded was noticeably absent. For the first time, Denton seemed uncertain, almost defensive. He sat at the head of the table, his fingers tapping nervously against the surface. It was a small crack in his armor, but one that Marcus immediately noticed. Denton was getting desperate. But then, just as Marcus began to relax, something unexpected happened. The door to the conference room opened, and in walked Karen, the CEO of the company. She was a formidable presence, known for her sharp mind and no-nonsense approach to business. Marcus had always respected her, but this sudden appearance was unsettling. "Sorry to interrupt," Karen said with a calm but commanding tone. "I thought I'd sit in on this meeting today." Marcus's stomach twisted. He knew this wasn't just a casual observation. Karen didn't sit in on meetings unless something serious was going on. Denton shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes briefly flicking toward Marcus, a silent warning flashing across his face. "What's going on here?" Karen asked, her gaze sweeping across the room. Denton quickly cleared his throat, recovering his composure. "Just the usual, Karen. We're going over the client presentation." His voice was tight, forced. Marcus stood tall, ready to make his case, but the presence of Karen changed everything. He couldn't just speak freely anymore. Everything had to be perfect. He launched into his presentation, walking through the details with precision, trying to block out the knot of anxiety in his chest, but something wasn't right. Halfway through the presentation, Denton interjected, his tone sharp and dismissive. "Marcus, you're missing the point. The client's priorities have shifted. This is not what we agreed on." Marcus paused, confusion flooding him. "What are you talking about?" "I've been working with the data we've been given." Denton's lips curled into a thin smile, his eyes glinting with a hint of malice. "Clearly, you haven't. We've been in touch with the client directly, and they've made some last-minute changes." He glanced toward Karen as if seeking her approval. "Isn't that right, Karen?" Karen nodded, but there was something strange about her expression. She didn't seem like she was in on the situation, but her gaze flickered toward Denton with a flicker of concern, almost as if she wasn't fully comfortable with what was happening. Marcus's mind raced. Denton had set him up. He had purposely withheld the updated information about the client's requirements, knowing full well that Marcus would look unprepared. It was a calculated move, designed to make him look incompetent in front of the CEO. But what stunned Marcus even more was Karen's reaction, or lack thereof. Why hadn't she stepped in and corrected the situation? Before he could process what was happening, Denton's voice cut through the tension again. "I'll take over from here, Marcus. I think we're done." His tone was smug, as if the victory had already been won. Marcus's pulse quickened, his mind whirling. This wasn't just about the presentation anymore. It was about his reputation, his future at the company. But then, in the midst of his rising frustration, a thought hit him like a lightning bolt. What if Karen didn't know? What if Denton was playing her just as much as he had been playing Marcus all along? The idea made Marcus's heart race. Could he turn this around? He had to try. He couldn't let Denton win this easily. "I'm sorry, Denton," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady despite the rising storm inside him. "But I think we should address this properly. If there are new requirements, then we need to discuss them. In front of the client, not behind closed doors." Denton's face darkened, his eyes narrowing with barely concealed anger. "You're not in charge here, Marcus," he snapped. "You don't get to make the decisions." Karen's eyes flickered between the two men, an unreadable expression on her face. The room had gone deathly silent, the air thick with tension. Just as the situation seemed ready to explode, a new voice broke through the silence. "Actually, Denton, I think Marcus is right." Everyone turned toward the door, where Jonathan stood, his face determined. The surprise of his sudden entrance sent a ripple of shock through the room. "I've been working closely with Marcus on this project," Jonathan continued, his voice calm but firm. "And I can confirm that there have been no updates from the client about changes to the requirements. This seems more like a last-minute attempt to undermine him." The room went silent, and for the first time, Denton looked rattled. His smug demeanor faltered, replaced with a flicker of panic. He had never expected Marcus to have backup. But just as quickly as the tension had escalated, it shifted again. Karen stood up, her gaze cold as she turned toward Denton. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice sharp. Denton opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He hesitated, his eyes darting from Marcus to Karen, but the damage was already done. The atmosphere in the room had shifted irrevocably. Karen could see it now. Denton's manipulations, his attempts to sabotage Marcus, all of it laid bare. Karen's eyes softened, and she turned back to Marcus. "I'm sorry for not stepping in sooner," she said, her tone apologetic but resolute. "We'll need to investigate what's been happening behind the scenes. This will not go unaddressed." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the moment almost overwhelming. He hadn't expected this kind of support. For a brief moment, he wondered if he had truly won, if this was the turning point. But as Denton slunk out of the room, muttering under his breath, Marcus knew the battle wasn't over. Karen turned back to him. "You've done good work, Marcus, but this isn't finished. Not yet." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The war wasn't over, it was just beginning. The days following the meeting were a whirlwind. The tension in the office had shifted. Denton was no longer the towering figure he once was. Karen had ordered a full investigation into the claims against him, and with Jonathan's testimony, Marcus had the backing he needed. The company had started to take notice, and Denton's grip on the power he'd once held seemed to loosen with every passing hour. Marcus could feel the momentum building. This was it. The moment he had worked so hard for was finally within reach. However, the victory was far from assured. Denton wasn't one to go down quietly. In the days that followed, Marcus began receiving anonymous messages, warnings, threats veiled in corporate jargon, and calls from blocked numbers telling him to watch his back. They were meant to intimidate, to get him to back down. But Marcus didn't flinch. He had seen too much, endured too much, and now he wasn't backing down. Not for anything. Then came the day when everything came to a head. The investigation into Denton's actions had reached its peak. Marcus had been called into Karen's office along with the head of HR, a stern but fair woman named Elaine. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation as Marcus sat across from them, his hands clasped together, his mind racing. He knew this was the final step, the resolution that would either free him or pull him back into Denton's web. "Marcus," Karen began, her tone serious but measured, "we've looked into your claims, and after speaking to several colleagues, including Jonathan and others who've witnessed Denton's behavior, it's clear that there have been serious lapses in leadership." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle in. "Denton will be removed from his position as manager. His actions will not go unpunished." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. A surge of relief washed over him, but it was tempered with the knowledge that this wasn't the end. Not yet. There was still a part of the puzzle he hadn't quite put together. But before Marcus could say anything, Elaine spoke up, her voice low and cautious. "There's more, though." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "More?" Elaine nodded, her expression grave. "As we were digging into Denton's files, we uncovered something unexpected. There's evidence suggesting that Denton wasn't acting alone. In fact, it seems like he had support from higher up the chain than we initially thought." The words hit Marcus like a thunderclap. Higher-ups? It wasn't just Denton. There was a bigger game at play, something he hadn't even considered. The ground seemed to shift beneath him as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. But who could be behind this? Who would want to take Denton's side in such a blatant act of sabotage? Karen leaned forward, her eyes sharp with focus. "It's not just Denton we're looking at now. We have reason to believe there's someone else in the company who's been pulling strings, someone much closer to the top." Marcus felt the walls closing in. He had been so focused on Denton, so wrapped up in his immediate battle for survival, that he hadn't considered the bigger picture. Now, as the reality of what was unfolding began to settle in, he realized how deep the corruption went. "We'll need your help," Karen said, her voice steady. "We can't do this without you, Marcus. You've been on the inside. You've seen what's going on." Marcus nodded, swallowing hard. He was no longer just fighting for his job. He was fighting for the integrity of the company, the trust that had been shattered by Denton's manipulations, and now this new, deeper betrayal. The next few days were a blur of meetings, investigations, and quiet conversations. Marcus and Karen had to tread carefully, uncovering more evidence while keeping their every move under wraps. They knew that the person behind this had to be someone who could cover their tracks well, someone who had been operating in the shadows for years. And then, just when Marcus thought they were close to discovering the truth, the final twist came. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind of quiet lull that often precedes chaos, when Marcus received a call, an unexpected one. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the ring of it sent a chill down his spine. "Marcus, it's time you knew the truth," the voice on the other end said, low and cryptic. "Who is this?" Marcus asked, his hand tightening around his phone. "You've been looking in the wrong direction," the voice continued, as though relishing the drama of the moment. "The person you've been targeting, not the mastermind. You'll find all the answers where you least expect it." The line went dead before Marcus could respond. His mind raced. Who was this person? And what did they mean by the wrong direction? He sat there, staring at the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment the call ended, a realization hit him like a wave. There was someone else in the company, someone he hadn't considered at all. He thought back to every moment, every conversation, and then it hit him. The one person who had always been one step ahead of him, the one who had always played the role of the calm, collected leader. Karen. Could it be possible? Had Karen been orchestrating this entire situation? Was she the one pulling the strings from the beginning, manipulating Marcus into doing her bidding, while she quietly set her own agenda into motion? His stomach turned as he recalled her words, how she'd said they needed his help. But now, looking back, those words seemed like a carefully crafted lie, a strategy to make him trust her. Marcus wasted no time. He began pulling strings on his own, quietly gathering the evidence he needed to confirm his suspicion. The deeper he dug, the more he realized how many people Karen had under her thumb. She had been playing both sides, appearing to stand with him while carefully making moves that would ensure her own ascent to power. She had manipulated the investigation, fed Marcus just enough information to keep him on her side, all while working behind the scenes to position herself as the one who would ultimately take over the company. The final confrontation came when Marcus confronted her directly, demanding answers in a private meeting. "I know what you've been doing," he said, his voice cold. "I know you've been using me to clear your path." Karen's eyes narrowed, but there was no denial, no regret in her gaze. "You were never meant to be a pawn, Marcus. You were meant to be the catalyst for change. But now the real change begins." With those words, the full extent of the betrayal was laid bare. The true mastermind had been Karen all along, using Denton and Marcus as pieces in her game, positioning herself to rise above them all. Marcus had fought for everything, only to realize that the true battle had just begun. The weight of the confrontation hung in the air like a storm about to break. Marcus stood across from Karen, his mind racing as the truth about her role in the entire scheme unraveled before him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable fallout. Karen sat back in her chair, her calm demeanor not wavering for an instant. "You've done well to get this far, Marcus," she said, her voice measured. "But you're still thinking too small. You've been playing the game the way you've been taught, but you're not seeing the bigger picture." Marcus's heart pounded. This wasn't the victory he had expected. He had thought he would face Denton and maybe one or two others, but Karen's cold revelation made everything shift. He had been set up, manipulated, and now he was caught in the web she had carefully spun. "You've been using me," he said, the words coming out more as a statement of fact than a question. Karen's lips curled into a smile, almost amused. "You were never a pawn, Marcus. You were a stepping stone. You've been essential in clearing the path for my ascension." The words stung like a slap, but Marcus wasn't about to let her see how deeply they affected him. He had come too far to back down now. "So what now? You just take over with everything you've done. You think I'm going to let you get away with it?" Karen's smile never faded. "You don't have a choice," she said, her voice unwavering. "I've already won." For a moment, the room was silent. Marcus stood there, caught between disbelief and anger, but something inside him shifted. He had spent too long fighting for a seat at the table, too long playing by the rules that others had set for him. Now he understood the truth. This wasn't a game about following rules or seeking permission. It was about taking control. "I don't think you get it, Karen," Marcus said, his voice firm, finally finding his footing. "You may have orchestrated everything up until now, but I'm not done yet. Not by a long shot." Karen's expression faltered for a second, the first crack in her otherwise unshakable facade. She clearly hadn't expected this response. "What are you going to do?" she asked, though her tone was tinged with skepticism. Marcus wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. He would expose the manipulation, the lies, and everything she had done to get to this point. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to let her pull the strings any longer. "I'll make sure the truth comes out," Marcus said, his voice steady. "The investigation into Denton was just the beginning. You'll have to answer for what you've done, and I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are." Karen stood up, her eyes flashing with fury. "You're delusional if you think you can take me down," she spat. "I've been running this company from the shadows. You're nothing compared to me." Marcus met her gaze, unflinching. "Maybe, but I'm not going anywhere. I've got the evidence I need, and I'm going to make sure the world knows what you've been up to." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, his mind focused, his resolve stronger than ever. Karen might have thought she had won, but Marcus knew that the real battle had only just begun. The next few days were a blur. Marcus worked tirelessly, gathering every scrap of evidence he could find. He called in allies from every corner of the company, people who had seen the cracks in the facade, who knew about Karen's manipulation and her ruthless climb to the top. With their help, he built a case, one that was undeniable. When the time came, Marcus presented the evidence to the board. There were no dramatic confrontations, no last-minute twists, just the cold, hard truth. Karen's manipulation, the way she had used Denton and Marcus, the way she had controlled the company's direction, all of it was laid bare for everyone to see. It wasn't easy. Karen fought back with every tool at her disposal: smear campaigns, subtle threats, and attempts to discredit Marcus. But the evidence spoke for itself. The board, once loyal to her, began to turn. Karen's position became increasingly untenable, her lies unraveling with every passing day. In the end, Karen was ousted. The truth had won, and the power dynamics within the company shifted in an instant. Marcus's victory wasn't just about one person being removed from power. It was about bringing integrity and transparency back to a system that had been corrupted for far too long. But the most significant shift was personal. Marcus didn't just become the boss, he became the kind of leader he had always aspired to be. He didn't let the power go to his head, didn't forget the struggles that had brought him to this point. He used his position to create opportunities for others, ensuring that the company's future was one built on trust and respect, not manipulation. As he looked out over the city from his new office, the weight of everything he had fought for settled on him. It had been a long road, filled with setbacks, betrayals, and moments of doubt. But in the end, it had been worth it. He had faced down corruption, fought for what was right, and come out victorious. Marcus smiled to himself, knowing that he had truly earned his place at the top. This wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a statement. No one could take this from him. He had won, not by playing the game, but by changing the rules entirely. As the days passed, Marcus's story became one of legend within the company. He wasn't just a success story, he was a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. And in the end, that was the real victory, showing that even in a world where power often belongs to those who manipulate and control, integrity and perseverance could still prevail. The lessons he had learned along the way were ones he would carry with him forever. Never let anyone define your worth. Never back down when you know you're right. And most importantly, always remember that the fight for what's just and true is never over. It's only just beginning.